He called a tow truck on a black man parked in his own driveway, but when the driver arrived and learned the truth, everything changed. What happened next will leave you speechless. Malcolm Carter pulled into his driveway, feeling the weight of a long and exhausting day. As an investigative journalist, he was accustomed to dealing with corruption and deception, but right now he just wanted to unwind. However, the sight before him made that impossible. A large tow truck was parked at the entrance to his home, its flashing yellow lights cutting through the evening dusk. A middle-aged woman stood beside the truck, wearing an expensive coat and clutching her phone tightly. Malcolm immediately recognized her, Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed neighborhood watchdog. She had a history of poking into other people's business, and now she was aggressively pointing at his car, giving orders to the tow truck driver. "This car doesn't belong here," Karen snapped, her voice sharp with authority. "I've never seen it before, and abandoned vehicles are not allowed in this neighborhood." Malcolm's brows furrowed. He had dealt with plenty of obstacles in his career, but this was his home. He stepped out of his car, keeping his voice calm. "This is my house," he said, pulling out his ID and car registration. "I live here. This is my property." Karen's face twisted with disbelief. She took a step back, crossing her arms as if Malcolm had just told her the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. "I don't think so," she scoffed. "You must be mistaken." Before Malcolm could respond, she turned away and dialed a number. His heart sank as he realized what she was doing, calling the police. Hank Lawson, the tow truck driver, shifted uncomfortably. He had worked in the business long enough to recognize a messy situation when he saw one. Usually, he received official tow orders from the city or property owners. This job had been different. The request came from a private source, which was unusual. Now, the supposed owner was standing right in front of him, disputing everything. Hank pulled out his work order and glanced at it again. Something wasn't right. The document lacked the usual city stamp and had no proper authorization. He hesitated, looking at Malcolm, who was now visibly frustrated. "Sir," Hank said cautiously, "this doesn't look like a standard tow request. Maybe we should clarify this before taking any action." "There's nothing to clarify," Karen interjected. "The police will handle it." Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. Two officers stepped out of their cruiser, their expressions unreadable. To Malcolm's frustration, they walked straight to Karen, greeting her as if they knew her. Karen wasted no time. "That man is trespassing on this property," she declared with absolute confidence, pointing at Malcolm. Malcolm took a deep breath, resisting the urge to argue. Instead, he calmly stepped forward and held out his ID again. "I live here. This is my home. My car is registered under my name." Officer Reynolds, a tall man with a hardened expression, examined the ID but did not hand it back immediately. "We need to verify your information," he said, his tone heavy with skepticism. The other officer turned to Hank, asking about the tow order. Hank hesitated before holding out the document. "This order, it doesn't seem official. It's missing city authorization." Reynolds barely glanced at it before nodding. "We'll handle that later. For now, we need to ensure everything checks out." Malcolm felt a cold realization creeping in. The way the officers were acting, Karen's determination, and the irregular tow request, it was too coordinated to be a simple misunderstanding. He had spent years exposing corruption in government and corporations. He had made enemies in high places. Could this be retaliation? Hank, still uneasy, ran his finger along the document, scanning the details more closely. His eyes landed on something that made his stomach twist: Everton Industries. That was the name listed under the requester. He had heard of them. Everton was a powerful security and surveillance company that had been in the news recently for shady dealings. If they were involved in this, then this was no ordinary neighborhood dispute. Malcolm saw Hank's expression change. He leaned in slightly, pretending to adjust his stance, and caught a glimpse of the paper. The moment his eyes landed on the name, his suspicions were confirmed. Everton Industries had been the subject of his recent investigation. He had uncovered evidence of illegal surveillance, tracking private citizens, and even government collusion. But he hadn't published his findings yet. Could they be trying to silence him? Before Malcolm could say anything, Officer Reynolds stepped forward. "We need to take your phone for verification." Malcolm gripped his phone tightly. "That won't be necessary," he said firmly. Reynolds smirked. "That's not up to you." Without warning, he reached forward and snatched the phone from Malcolm's grasp. Malcolm's pulse quickened. This wasn't just intimidation, it was an operation. They were cutting him off from the outside world. If they controlled his communication, they controlled the narrative. He had to think fast. Hank, sensing the tension rising, made a split-second decision. He fumbled with the tow truck controls, pretending to have an issue with the hook. A loud screech echoed through the street as the metal arm lurched forward violently. Karen shrieked and jumped back. The officers turned in surprise, momentarily distracted. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He bolted. Darting past the officers, he sprinted toward his house, his heart pounding. They shouted after him, but he didn't stop. He shoved the door open, rushing inside. He had only seconds. His laptop, his hard drive, all his evidence were in his office. If they got their hands on them, everything would be lost. Grabbing his hard drive, he turned to leave, just as the officers stormed inside. "Stop right there," Reynolds barked. Malcolm's eyes darted to the back door. He had one chance. Without thinking, he lunged toward it, shoving it open. But the moment he stepped outside, he froze. 3 men in dark suits stood near an unmarked black car. Their gazes locked onto him. They weren't police. They were something worse, corporate enforcers. One of them reached into his jacket. Malcolm didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. He turned and ran. Behind him, voices shouted orders. Footsteps pounded against pavement. The chase was on. Back at the truck, Hank clenched his jaw. He had seen corruption before, but this was something else. Malcolm was being hunted, and Hank had unknowingly helped set the trap. He looked down at the tow order one last time, gripping it tightly. This wasn't over. Whatever Everton Industries was up to, Malcolm wasn't the only one in danger now. Hank had a choice to make, and for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what the right thing was. Hank Lawson stood beside his tow truck, gripping the tow request, his gut twisting with unease. He wasn't the kind of man to interfere in situations that weren't his business, but this felt different. The way Malcolm Carter was being treated, the tension in the air, it all felt wrong. He glanced down at the paperwork again, reading it more carefully this time. That's when he noticed something strange. The request hadn't come from the city or even a private homeowner. It came from a security firm. "That's not normal," Hank muttered under his breath, frowning. Tow requests were supposed to come from property owners or government officials, not private corporations. His eyes moved further down the page, and when he saw the name at the bottom, his heart skipped a beat. Everton Industries. He had seen that name before. It had been all over the news recently for the wrong reasons, accusations of illegal surveillance, corporate espionage, and political ties that made them untouchable. Why would a company like that care about a single parked car? Meanwhile, Malcolm kept his eyes locked on the officers, his instincts screaming that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. He had spent years uncovering corruption, and this had all the hallmarks of something deeper. His patience was wearing thin. He needed to get inside his house, his laptop, hard drives, everything that held his research was in there. And if Everton Industries was behind this, he had no doubt they were after his work. Hank made a small but deliberate move, tapping his fingers against the paperwork. Malcolm's sharp eyes caught it instantly. Taking a slow step forward, he pretended to adjust his stance and stole a glance at the paper. The moment he saw the name Everton Industries, he felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Everton. Malcolm's voice was low, but the urgency was clear. His mind raced. Everton Industries wasn't just a tech conglomerate. They had deep ties to government surveillance programs, private security firms, and law enforcement agencies. And more importantly, he had been investigating them for months. He had uncovered proof that Everton was running an illegal surveillance network, tracking journalists, politicians, and activists. His last report had revealed a fraction of what they were doing, but he hadn't published everything yet. Could this be their way of shutting him down? Officer Reynolds stepped forward, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "We need to take your phone for verification," he said, extending his hand. Malcolm's fingers tightened around his device. He wasn't about to hand over his only way of contacting his sources. "That won't be necessary," he replied, his voice calm but firm. Reynolds' smirk didn't fade. He moved faster than Malcolm expected, snatching the phone right out of his hand. "You don't have a choice," Reynolds said. Malcolm's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They were cutting him off, isolating him. If they were going to this extent, then they knew. They knew what he had found. If he let them stall him any longer, it was over. Hank sensed the growing tension and knew he had to act. He fumbled with the controls of his tow truck, pretending to have an issue with the hook. The machinery let out a loud, grinding noise, causing the officers to turn for just a second. It was all the time Malcolm needed. Without hesitating, he took a step back, then bolted. "Stop him!" Reynolds shouted, but Malcolm was already moving. He sprinted toward his front door, every muscle in his body burning with urgency. He shoved the door open and rushed inside. He had minutes, maybe seconds. He grabbed his laptop, his portable hard drive, and shoved them into his bag. The evidence he had gathered was the only thing keeping him from disappearing like so many others who had gone up against companies like Everton. Footsteps pounded against the pavement outside. The officers were coming. He turned toward the back exit, but the moment he stepped into the hallway, he froze. Through the window, he saw them. 3 men in dark suits standing beside an unmarked black car. They weren't police. These were Everton's enforcers, and they had been waiting for him. One of the men reached into his jacket. Malcolm didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. He spun on his heel and darted toward the back of the house. He didn't have a plan, just the certainty that if they caught him, he'd never be seen again. Back outside, Hank made a decision. He had spent years keeping his head down, doing his job and avoiding trouble. But this was different. He had been pulled into something bigger, and his gut told him that Malcolm wasn't just some guy causing a scene. He was in real danger. As the officers turned their attention to the chase, Hank took one last look at the forged tow request in his hand. He knew exactly what he had to do. While Malcolm ran for his life, Hank quietly slipped away, clutching the document tightly. He needed to find out who had really sent it and why. Because if Everton Industries was going this far to silence one man, then the truth he had uncovered was more dangerous than anyone realized. Malcolm knew he was running out of time. The police officers were stalling, Karen was still ranting, and Hank, the tow truck driver, stood uncertainly near his vehicle. The tension in the air was suffocating, but Malcolm forced himself to appear calm. He needed to make his next move carefully. "Fine," he muttered, raising his hands slightly. "Do whatever you have to do." Officer Reynolds smirked, as if he had won. He took a step forward, ready to grab Malcolm's arm. But Hank, who had been observing everything closely, noticed something subtle in Malcolm's stance. A shift in his weight, the tightening of his fingers. Malcolm wasn't surrendering. He was waiting for an opportunity. Hank made a split-second decision. He reached for the controls on his tow truck and yanked the lever, causing the heavy metal hook to swing wildly with a loud screech. The unexpected noise startled everyone. Karen gasped and took a step back, while the officers flinched and turned toward the disturbance. That was all Malcolm needed. In one swift motion, he pivoted on his heels and bolted toward his house. His heart pounded in his chest as he dashed past the officers, their delayed shouts ringing behind him. He reached his front door, shoved it open, and slammed it shut behind him. He didn't have much time. He rushed to his office, snatching up his laptop and the portable hard drive where he had stored the most crucial pieces of evidence against Everton Industries. If they got their hands on this, everything would be lost. Heavy footsteps pounded against his wooden porch. They were coming in. Malcolm sprinted through his house, heading for the back door. He yanked it open, only to stop dead in his tracks. 3 men stood outside, dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. They weren't local police. These were corporate enforcers. Their presence confirmed his worst fear. This wasn't just an attempt to harass him. This was a full-scale operation to silence him. One of the men reached into his jacket. Malcolm didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. He turned sharply and ran toward the side of the house, leaping over the short fence and dashing toward the woods behind his property. The moment his feet hit the uneven ground, he heard them following. The crackling of leaves and snapping of twigs told him they were close. Too close. "Find him!" one of the men barked. "Don't let him get away." Malcolm pushed forward, his lungs burning as he weaved through the trees. The darkness of the woods gave him cover, but it also made it difficult to navigate. He forced himself to stay focused. He had spent months exposing Everton's illegal operations, surveillance, government corruption, secret deals with law enforcement. He had known he was making enemies, but he hadn't expected them to act so aggressively. Back at the house, Hank was still standing by his truck, watching the chaos unfold. He could have left. It came from a security firm, one connected to Everton Industries. He let out a slow breath, realizing the truth. "This was never about the car," he muttered. "They set him up." Making a split-second decision, he stuffed the document into his pocket and quietly backed away. If these men were willing to go this far, then Malcolm had to have something valuable. Something worth risking everything for. Meanwhile, Malcolm kept running, but he knew he couldn't outrun them forever. His breath was ragged, his muscles aching. He needed a plan. Then he spotted it. A fallen tree trunk, wide enough to conceal him. He dropped behind it, forcing himself to breathe silently. The footsteps slowed. The men were near. "He's close," one of them said. "Spread out. Check the area." Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out his spare phone. His primary phone had been taken by the officers, but he always kept a backup. He quickly typed a message and sent it to the only person he could trust right now, James Holloway, a fellow journalist. "In trouble. Everton involved. Need help." He hit send just as he heard movement to his left. One of the men was coming too close. Malcolm's heart pounded, but he remained still. The man hesitated, scanning the area, before finally moving away. Malcolm exhaled slowly. He needed to get out of here, and fast. Back in the city, James Holloway was sitting at his desk when his phone buzzed. He frowned as he read Malcolm's message. Without hesitation, he grabbed his keys and headed out. If Malcolm was right, and James had no doubt he was, then this was bigger than anyone had realized. As Malcolm carefully moved through the woods, his mind raced. The people chasing him weren't just trying to scare him. They wanted to erase him, but he wasn't going to let that happen. Somewhere in the distance, sirens blared. Maybe Hank had done something. Maybe help was coming. Or maybe this was just another trap. Whatever it was, Malcolm knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't over yet. Malcolm didn't stop running until he was deep in the woods. His breath came in quick gasps as he crouched behind a fallen tree, his fingers gripping the rough bark. The cold night air stung his lungs, but he forced himself to stay still. The men searching for him weren't amateurs. They moved in precise patterns, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like knives. He heard one of them speak in a low, commanding tone. "Spread out. He's close." Malcolm knew they wouldn't stop until they found him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small backup phone. It was an old model, no tracking features, no unnecessary apps. He dialed a number, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Malcolm." The voice on the other end was sharp, professional. Daniel Reeves, a federal prosecutor Malcolm had worked with before. "No time to explain," Malcolm whispered, keeping his voice low. "I'm being hunted. I have evidence against Everton Industries, government ties, illegal surveillance, police involvement. I need help." There was a brief pause, then Reeves' tone hardened. "Where are you?" Malcolm hesitated. He knew Everton had deep connections, and he couldn't be sure if his call was being monitored. "Somewhere near the outskirts of West Ridge. Heading south." Reeves understood immediately. "Stay on the move. I'll send someone I trust. A twig snapped nearby. Malcolm's muscles tensed. The men were getting closer. I have to move, he said and ended the call. He slipped deeper into the forest, keeping low, using the darkness as cover. Meanwhile, Hank Lawson sat in his truck, gripping a document in his hands. He had parked in an abandoned lot on the edge of town, the glow of a single streetlight illuminating the paper. He had gone through it a dozen times, and the more he read, the more his stomach churned. The towing request hadn't come from the city or a private resident. The signature at the bottom belonged to an executive from Everton Industries. This wasn't a misunderstanding, Hank muttered under his breath. They wanted Malcolm gone. He picked up his phone and called James Holloway, a journalist who had worked with Malcolm before. When James answered, Hank wasted no time. I have proof that Everton Industries is behind this, he said. A signed document ordering his car to be removed. James sounded alert. If this is true, we have to move fast. They won't let this get out. I know, Hank said grimly. Which is why we need to find Malcolm before they do. Malcolm moved carefully through the woods, his muscles aching from the relentless chase. He was nearing the edge of the forest when he suddenly found himself face to face with two of the men who had been hunting him. There you are, one of them sneered. Without hesitation, he lunged forward. Malcolm reacted instantly. He ducked, using his momentum to throw the man off balance. The second attacker swung at him, but Malcolm sidestepped just in time, grabbing a thick branch from the ground. He swung it hard, striking the man's shoulder. The attacker grunted in pain but didn't fall. Instead, he reached for something under his jacket. Malcolm didn't wait to see what it was. He swung again, hitting the man's wrist, sending a small device clattering to the ground. A stun gun. If they got him with that, it was over. Gathering the last of his strength, he kicked the first man in the knee, sending him crashing into the dirt. The second attacker lunged again, but Malcolm twisted away and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. He gasped, stumbling backward. Malcolm didn't stay to fight. He turned and ran. Just when he thought he was in the clear, he saw the unmistakable glow of flashing blue lights ahead. Police. But something was off. The cars were unmarked, and the men standing beside them weren't wearing standard police uniforms. These weren't real officers. These were Everton's enforcers, dressed to look official. A cold realization settled in. He was trapped. Before they could move in, a loud screech filled the air. A car skidded to a stop just feet away. The driver's door flew open, and a familiar voice shouted, "Get in, Hank." Malcolm didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the truck and threw himself inside. Hank slammed his foot on the gas, sending the vehicle roaring forward. The enforcers dove out of the way as the truck sped past them, disappearing into the night. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The sound of the engine and Malcolm's heavy breathing filled the space. Finally, Hank broke the silence. "They're not just after you," he said. "They're covering their tracks. And they'll do whatever it takes." Malcolm nodded, still catching his breath. "I know. But we have proof now." He held up a small flash drive. "I downloaded files from my laptop before they could take me. It has everything: internal emails, transaction records, surveillance data. If we get this to the right people, we can expose them." Hank gripped the wheel tightly. "Then we better move fast." Malcolm looked out the window, his mind racing. The chase wasn't over, but for the first time they had the upper hand. Everton Industries had tried to silence him, but they had underestimated just how far he was willing to go for the truth. This fight was far from over. The next morning, the world knew the truth. Malcolm Carter's name was everywhere. News headlines flashed across television screens and online articles. Journalist Malcolm Carter uncovers corporate government conspiracy, Everton Industries exposed, illegal surveillance, corrupt law enforcement ties, and shocking evidence of police collusion with private security firms. The impact was immediate. Federal agents raided multiple Everton Industries offices, arresting several mid-level officials and placing key figures under investigation. The story had been too big to silence. "This is just the beginning," Malcolm told a group of reporters gathered outside a federal building. His face was tired, but his voice was steady. The people in power will try to cover their tracks. But we won't let them. He knew this wasn't the end. The top executives of Everton Industries had vanished. The true masterminds were still out there, watching, waiting. Karen Whitmore, the so-called neighborhood watchdog, had also become a target of public scrutiny. She stood before cameras, shifting uncomfortably as reporters pressed her for answers. "I had no idea I was being used," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I thought I was helping my neighborhood." But Malcolm wasn't convinced. He watched her carefully as she spoke. Regret? Maybe. Fear? Definitely. The question was, who was she afraid of? "Do you really expect us to believe that?" one reporter asked. Karen swallowed hard but didn't respond. Hank Lawson, the tow truck driver, had also found himself in the spotlight. Unlike Karen, he didn't avoid the truth. "I just did what was right," he told reporters. But Malcolm knew better. Hank had risked everything to help him escape that night. Without Hank's quick thinking, he might not be standing here today. That night, Malcolm returned to his home, a place that no longer felt secure. He sat at his desk, staring at the files spread out before him. There were still too many unanswered questions. How deep did this conspiracy go? Who else was involved? As he reached for his laptop, a notification appeared on his screen. An anonymous message. "You won this round, but we are still watching." A cold chill ran down his spine. He read the words again, his jaw tightening. Everton Industries had been exposed, but the real players had slipped through the cracks. They were still out there, still pulling strings. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was Daniel Reeves, the federal prosecutor he had contacted before his escape. "Malcolm, we need to meet. Now." Malcolm grabbed his coat and headed out. The city streets were quiet at this hour, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. When he reached the meeting spot, a dimly lit parking garage, Reeves was already there, pacing nervously. "I found something," Reeves said in a hushed voice, handing Malcolm a folder. "We searched Everton's financial records. There were secret payments, large amounts, being funneled to a private organization. The name is blacked out, but we traced it to a shell company. And you won't believe who's connected to it." Malcolm opened the folder and felt his breath hitch. A name he never expected. Someone high up in the government. Someone with the power to bury this story forever. Before Malcolm could react, the screech of tires echoed through the garage. A black SUV skidded to a stop, and men in dark suits stepped out. "Run," Reeves hissed. Malcolm didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, weaving between parked cars as the men gave chase. His heart pounded as he reached an exit, but just as he stepped outside, another car pulled up. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a familiar face. "Hank!" Malcolm gasped. "Get in!" Hank shouted. Malcolm hesitated for only a second before diving into the passenger seat. Hank floored the gas pedal, and the car shot forward, tires screeching. In the rearview mirror, Malcolm saw the men scrambling back to their SUV, but they were already too late. Hank smirked. "Guess I'm your getaway driver now." Malcolm exhaled, still gripping the folder. "You have no idea how bad this is." "Oh, I think I do," Hank replied. "And I'm guessing you have a plan?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He glanced at the folder again, knowing what had to be done. "First, we expose this name. Then we make sure they can't cover it up." Hank nodded, turning the car onto a quiet road. "Then let's get to work." The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was only just beginning. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights the reality of racial profiling and the dangers of making assumptions based on bias. This scenario serves as a reminder of the importance of fairness, respect, and standing up against discrimination. Our goal is to spark awareness, challenge prejudice, and encourage conversations that lead to positive change.